Well, welcome back. Hello again. It's Chris here with the Daba Africa. And this time talking about Namibia once again. For those who thought it was a far off place at the other end of the continent there in Africa, well, it sure gets a lot of attention, certainly for me anyway. So today I'm coming to you to talk about a recent opinion piece, an op-ed that appeared in the Namibian, newspaper based in Windhoek. Quite a damning op-ed, and so I'd like to talk about it here. I'll read the first paragraph, first couple sentences off here, just to help frame the discussion as to what's going on. So in this op-ed, which appeared on the 3rd of April, I gave myself a couple days to think about this, they say the relentless economic recession since 2015, the fish rot expose at the end of last year, and now the coronavirus have shown beyond doubt that Namibia requires an urgent and drastic reboot. What specifically are the editors talking about? Well, they call for 4 changes to Namibia's political structure. And those are the regeneration of moral and ethical values. That's the first one. The changing of the political structures. A second. A third one would be the allocation of natural resources. And the fourth one, the reforming of quasi-government entities. Read parastatals or state-owned enterprises for that one. So I'll repeat those. The regeneration of moral and ethical values, changing the political structure of Namibia, allocation of natural resources, and reframing quasi-government entities or state-owned enterprises, also known as parastatals. Well, that's quite a damning commentary. So let me read a few comments from this op-ed, and then I'll discuss one of the primary issues I'd like to talk about, which is state-owned enterprises. Those of you who know me know that that's one of my pet peeves, state-owned enterprises. So in the article, they talk about the fact that the reason that Namibia is not prepared for the Wuhan coronavirus, or COVID-19 by its scientific name, the reason that they're not prepared for this pandemic is owing to short-sighted leadership, especially on the part of the ruling party SWAPO. SWAPO being the Southwest Africa People's Organization, the ruling party since independence. Wow. Among moral and ethical values, one of the challenges the op-ed talks about here is there is an unhealthy appetite for luxury, which emerged as early as 1992 when the government bought a presidential jet while they were begging foreign nations for assistance on drought relief. Last year's fish rot scandal may have been sensational only because the apparent scheme of corruption and kickbacks was so obvious that politicians could no longer cover up for each other. The editors say that in reality, it's just the tip of an iceberg. This is a visible manifestation of years of wholesale pickpocketing of public resources and public funds. Wow. That is a damning editorial about Namibia. When it comes to political structure, they complain that the state payroll is bloated and that the state spends far too much money on government positions. An example of that is the annual budget of 60 billion Namibian dollars. 29 billion of that, nearly half, goes to salaries alone, which leaves precious little for the government to provide services to Namibians. Fair point. And then we get to the quasi-government entities or parastatals. One of the challenges with that, of course, is that these parastatals often mean jobs for comrades, as the op-ed says. It says that quasi-government bodies, parastatals, have provided another avenue for jobs for comrades, paid the highest salaries for the lowest output. Many state-owned enterprises have distorted the market despite constantly depending on taxpayer funds for bailouts. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly my issue when it comes to state-owned enterprises. I'm not saying it's always inappropriate or impossible to have a government-owned business, but it is not a healthy approach to take. They tend to crowd out the public or the private sector, and they force out competition and thereby reduce choice, raise rates, and are not accountable for poor service. And they also are patronage machines. And when it comes to natural resources, they talk about 2 things in particular that have caused significant problems in the view of the Namibian, the newspaper. That is black economic empowerment, the same issue that we see across the border in South Africa, and Namibization, which have both been used, as they say, to enrich a privileged elite connected to politicians. Well, I can't argue with that. I would say that's very accurate. The same situation is prevalent across the border in South Africa, where BEE has not resulted in the uplifting of the previously disadvantaged population, but rather created a nouveau riche class, a small class of the connected, the privileged, the elites, those who can have access to those in power and profit from it. So let's talk a little bit about what these guys are talking about. When it comes to state-owned, well, before we go to state-owned enterprise, let me talk a little bit about the labor force in Namibia. So the labor force in Namibia today is, let's see if we can get this up here where you can see it. All right, let's get that on the screen. There you go. All right, so labor force in Namibia today is a little over 1 million people, 1,090,153. You can see it there at the top. And in 2016, there were 486,000 people working in Namibia in the formal sector. In 2018, that had declined to just 401,000. The population didn't decline, mind you, but those employed. That represents a 17% drop in formal employment. That's insane. Can you imagine losing 17% of the jobs here in the United States in a workforce of approximately 150 million people? That would, well, we can imagine it with the coronavirus. We may see it here in the very near future. With 10 million jobless claims over the last 2 weeks, we may see that jump. But that would be somewhere in the order of about 24 million people going unemployed. That is quite a difference from what they had just 2 years prior. Now, in the workforce, we see that the government employed 88,421 in 2016. That was down to 86,000 in 2018. This is according to the Namibian labor report that comes out, 2018 being the most recent available to the public. In addition to that, 25,558 were employed by state-owned enterprises. So in effect, they were government employees because the organizations they work for belong to the government. So we add those two together. And then in 2018, you had 30,000. There's a jump there. So while the labor force dropped by 85,000, less people in the formal sector working employed, those working in the government payroll climbed slightly from 113 to 117,000. That doesn't sound like a large number, but with a huge decline in formal employment, that means that the number of people relying on a government job has increased from 23.7% to 29.1%. Nearly 1 out of 3 people working in the formal sector in Namibia is currently on a government payroll. That's a shocking number. And the Namibian makes the assertion that that is a bloated payroll, and I certainly cannot disagree with that. That's something that should be looked at. But also more alarming, if you look at, is the labor participation rate. If there are 1,090,000 people in the labor force in Namibia, but only 401,000 people working, that is less than 40% labor participation. There's an awful lot of people who are not in the workforce. Now, of course, you have the elderly, retired, infirm, in prison. You also have those who are enrolled in school, youth, minors, those at university. But nonetheless, a labor participation rate of just 17%. I actually threw numbers in there. I shouldn't have gotten there. Let me correct myself. The labor participation rate doesn't include those folks. We're just talking about the people who are working age 15 to 65, and that's 1,090,000. And less than 40% of those people are actively engaged in the formal economy. That's disastrous. And these are things that need to be looked at. The Namibian is saying that the combination of these factors with ethical shortfalls, moral shortfalls by the government, the political structure, which is overburdening the country with too much political administration, and the way that resources are allocated around the country, natural resources, and then the state-owned enterprises all combine to create this situation in which Namibia is not growing, it's stagnant and actually declining. So it's difficult to argue with them. But when it comes to state-owned enterprises, one of my favorite pet peeves, those of you who know me and follow me, let's talk about that. Well, it depends on what you're talking about. There are reportedly 22 commercial state-owned enterprises, and things like Namibian Power, Nam Power, and then Air Namibia. These are entities that are considered to be commercial entities. So there are, however, at least 97 state-owned enterprises that the government controls, all sorts of things. Let me run through a list of some of these just to come off the top of the list right here. So you've got the Veterans Subversion Fund, you have Agribank, you have Namport, the National Youth Service, Namibian Statistics Agency. Now, some of these are reasonable activities for a government to run, like the Namibian Statistics Agency. That is certainly a role for the government. But the New Era, a state-owned newspaper. Why does the government own a newspaper? It's not necessary. And many other things here. So 97 state-owned enterprises, but of those, 22 are commercial enterprises, things that arguably should certainly be in the private domain. So let me run through a list of some of those that I would recommend that the government start divesting themselves of. NamPower, I've already mentioned, the Development Bank of Namibia, Telecom Namibia, Air Namibia, the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation, the Namibia Ports Authority, the Motor Vehicle Accident Fund. Why is the government running an insurance scheme for the public? This is something that a private insurance company should be doing, with oversight from the government, of course. The Namibia Airports Company. In South Africa, the Airports Company of South Africa is a private entity, not owned by the state. And it performs the same function that the Namibian Airports Company does in Namibia. So why can it not be a private organization? And then also something that gets a lot of attention is the Namibia Wildlife Resorts. The name itself beggars the imagination why a government would be owning something called a resort. That is not the role of government. Well, that's just a few that I recommend that they get rid of. So this is not exactly something that has been ignored. The question of state-owned enterprises have been discussed for many years. Going back to 2001, there was something known as a National Governance Framework, which addressed this. Then again, in 2003, the Central Governance Agency was created to oversee these things. In 2006, 2008, more governance laws were passed for state-owned enterprises, or these parastatals. And again, in 2015, there was an amendment to the act. Yet little has changed. They're still full of bloated staffs with many inept people who are not effective at their jobs and not getting a return on profit. The vast majority of these state-owned enterprises are in the red and have been in the red, remain in the red, no matter what has happened in Namibia. And no one is holding them to account. There are no shareholders to respond to, only members of the government. And the government has not been holding them accountable. Hence the sharp criticism from the Namibian in their op-ed that just came out. So finally, a Public Enterprises Governance Act of 2019 was passed, and the current Public Enterprise Minister, who is Leon Justa from Namibia, he is responsible for reforming this. One of the current reforms is to stop people from being members of multiple state-owned enterprises. Part of the way of doling out patronage, friendship, and taking care of your friends and family is to appoint them to be a board member and get a lucrative paycheck for doing very little. Now, board members and lucrative paychecks is not unique to Namibia. That is a phenomenon the world over. But in private corporations, the vast majority of people are appointed to a board because of their experience in industry, in business, or because they're connected in some way that can help benefit an organization. But that is not necessarily the case when it comes to Namibia with these appointments. So this is the situation. The Namibian has expressed their opinion. It's a rather harsh opinion, but I find myself challenged to take issue with it. Once again, there are 4 points in here that they're criticizing the government of Namibia. First is they call for a regeneration of moral and ethical values, charging the government with being corrupt and having the wrong approach to governance. In other words, focusing on luxury and themselves rather than governing the population. They also talk about changing the political structures, thinking that the structure is overly burdensome for Namibia and costly, and looking at the fact that nearly 30% of the informal workforce works for the government in one form or another. That is a situation that's difficult to argue with. Then again, the third thing was the allocation of natural resources and how those things are divvied out. Reforming quasi-government entities. I would add to these 4 charges also the issue of SWAPO, now being in power since 1990, not adequately addressing education and ensuring equal opportunity in public education for all Namibian children. This is a serious concern. Beyond that is also the historical issue of land. I'm not saying necessarily land restitution, but a question of land. There are a number of people in Namibia who would like to participate in the farming and the agricultural sector, but they are unable to do so, in part because they don't own land. The government should have an effective land program, not simply expropriation, and certainly not expropriation without compensation, but a program that is focused on helping small-scale farmers and others who would like to get into the sector find their way into it, and give them extension services so they're able to actually farm, and help them prepare for being farmers, provide credit, access, technical assistance through extension services, that sort of thing. So once again, let me sum up with the situation with the labor in Namibia. Just over 1 million people in the labor force, of which less than 40% are employed in formal employment. But nearly 30% of the formal workforce works for the government in one form or another. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is a rundown, a summary of this harsh op-ed that appeared in the Namibian newspaper. One that, once again, I have difficulty taking issue with many of the things that they claim. So what will happen in Namibia? Will this crisis with COVID-19 change Namibia's governance structure? Will the SWAPO government wake up to the reality? Look at the last election. The president only got 56% of the popular vote. Quite a shock to the system. And SWAPO's share of the vote declined markedly as well. Let's see what happens going forward. But that's the situation today in Namibia as it confronts COVID-19. I thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention. Once again, if you like these videos, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, those close to you, those you keep at a distance during social distancing. Please share widely. I thank you for that. If you like the video, go ahead and push that little button, smash right there. It says like. I always appreciate that. And again, I take suggestions and recommendations for video topics. Be doing a live stream here very soon on the security sector reform of the Armed Forces of Liberia. If you're interested in that, that should be the following Saturday from today. Today is the 5th, so that must be 6 days. On the 11th of April is the plan right now. So tune in with us then. I thank you for your time and your attention. Hang in there. We're all going to get through this together.